Hi, good morning, and welcome to the fifth in our series of What to Do this week. I think this is probably the next few weeks will be really where things are going to get harder before they get easier. We know it's not going to last forever, but it is going to be quite tough. Back in 2003, when we started producing events on SARS and pandemic planning, much heed was given to employee mental health. It's a huge focus now for employers, and I think it's interesting that that's one of the key changes for all people involved in pandemic planning, that this is something that employers are really having to set up and take very, very seriously. So as we enter a more intense phase, employers, along with obviously trying to help their employees through a whole new way of working, are also going to be dealing with illnesses and, sadly, in many cases, death. So how employers are coping is obviously part of our duty of care. We're going to look today at warning signs, and we have a couple of experts in well-being who will be helping us with that. Unfortunately, some employees are struggling to work productively from home. So employers have asked us to look at how we set, manage, and monitor realistic productivity expectations. Stephen Bevan from the Institute of Employment Studies is going to be giving us some pointers on how to do that sensitively and effectively. And finally, possibly most importantly, Vince Toman of Lewis Silkin is back with us this week to help guide us through the most recent furlough directives. He tells me these are definitely the last ones. So he will make sure that we're all working with the most up-to-date guidelines. Welcome back, everybody who has been here before. And for those of you who haven't, the question and answers will run at the end of the presentations, but we do ask that you upload questions as they occur to you, as you can do if you look to the right of your screen, just as they pop into your head, and we will make sure that they are answered to the best of the expert's ability at the end. There will be polls as we go along, and of course, as always, the handouts. I will put a poll up now for you to answer. And in the meantime, we are delighted to introduce you to Stephen Bevan, who's Head of HR Research Development at the Institute for Employment Studies. He'll be talking to you today about working from home policy and practice. And thank you very much indeed for responding to the poll. Stephen, would you like to join us now?
Okay, I'm here.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Right. Thank you very much. And hello to everyone. I hope you're doing okay in these weird times. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we've learned about working from home. We have the advantage of perhaps of having done some research on this just since the beginning of the lockdown. And there are a number of things that I think are potentially quite helpful to people who are working out how to cope with what is now being called the new normal. I mean, what is clear is that we've got millions more workers in the UK who are working from home since the start of the coronavirus lockdown. I think the data suggests it's about 15% of people before the crisis were working routinely at home. And now we've seen those numbers go up significantly. And we've calculated that there are about 7.2 million of those are working parents and another 700,000 are lone parents. So there is a challenge here about people, having difficulty with that separation between what is their work responsibility and their domestic and caring responsibility. And that's something I'll come back to in a second. But it probably represents one of the biggest and the fastest shifts in working patterns that we've ever had, apart from world wars and so on. Right at the start of the lockdown, we set off a working at home wellbeing survey because we wanted to track right from the start how people were coping in terms of their morale, their working patterns, communication, but also different aspects of people's physical and psychological well-being. And the link at the bottom of this slide, which you can download in the handout section, will take you to the interim findings of that survey, which we published last week. And we're keeping the questionnaire open through the rest of April. So there's another link at the end of these slides, so you can fill the questionnaire in yourself or get some of your colleagues to as well. And what I want to do is take you through some of the positives and the negatives from that survey, and try and draw out what the implications are for managers when you're trying to manage a more remote workforce. So let's try the first slide transition. Oh, that worked, good. So what's the story about lockdown so far, and what are the implications that managers and HR professionals should take from this? We've got responses from over 500 people so far, and that number is growing. What we found is that by and large, the people who are working at home are a relatively privileged group. There tend to be people in white collar roles, professional, technical, managerial, from public services, service sector, and so on. So it's certainly not representative of the whole workforce. But what we found, there's a sort of balance sheet, really. There's some good news. So people were reporting that they were really very positive about the fact they didn't have to commute. They, in general, feeling a better balance or less of a really clear boundary between work and home, which they broadly were managing pretty well, and they enjoyed the sort of flexibility and the autonomy of working at home. Most of them felt that their productivity was increased, or they certainly felt they were in control of the things that affected their productivity. For the most part, people felt they were being trusted by their organisation, and particularly by their immediate boss. And also people felt that they were able to have more influence over the quality of the work they were doing, that they were able to perhaps to be a bit more autonomous and make decisions about how to do things, which perhaps they weren't necessarily entitled or empowered to do under normal circumstances. And they're quite enjoying that part of it. And also many of them were saying they got fewer distractions than working in an office. So there are a number of different positive things that people were reporting. And I think in general, people's morale and motivation seem to be undiminished, 3 weeks into the lockdown. And obviously that remains to be seen how that can be sustained, but there are some fairly positive stories there. On the debit side, we saw quite a very significant increase in musculoskeletal pain. Whilst the sort of stereotype of someone being hunched over their laptop at the kitchen table may not be far wide of the mark, certainly in terms of things like neck and shoulder and back pain, we'd seen more than 50% of people reporting that they had an increase in aches and pains to the musculoskeletal system. A significant proportion of respondents said that they were taking less exercise, that their diet wasn't so good, and over 2/3 said that they'd lost sleep in the last 2 weeks before the survey because of worries. And some of that's going to be about work, but a lot of it won't be. It's going to be COVID related, I suspect. There was a significant minority of people who felt upset about being isolated and found that was more and more difficult to cope with. We found that people with elder care responsibilities were struggling a little bit more in terms of the balance, although paradoxically not people with children so much, which is interesting. Parents seem to be coping pretty well. We've used the WHO measure of mental well-being in the survey, which is quite a good, robust measure. And that does seem to differentiate between different subgroups in our survey population. And we found particularly younger people seem to be struggling more with their mental health than older people. And some of those issues are around finance, health worries about both themselves, but family members, but also people are worried about mortgages and particularly rents. That certainly was an issue. And so financial well-being is something that I think organisations need to take care of. And then we found communication was an interesting one. We found that in general, people were happier if they had regular, both formal and informal contact with their colleagues in their team. And we've seen examples of people setting up WhatsApp groups and so on, not necessarily to exchange information about work, but to be more socially connected. But we found that the mental health of people who were communicated with more regularly by their direct boss was much better. So feeling a bit neglected or isolated, or feeling that decisions are being made without your involvement, might be risking people's mental health. And that's something I think which is an important pointer for what managers need to be doing about this. So we started drawing out some of the lessons for managers that we've found from the survey, but also from some of the other work we're doing on the way people are being managed in the sort of modern working environments. The first thing to bear in mind, of course, is that the employers continue to have a legal duty of care for the health and well-being of the workforce. And of course, it's a lot more difficult remotely to do things like risk assessments or people's ergonomics at home, and also the psychosocial risks that people are facing. And I don't think the health and safety executive is going to come down heavily on employers at a time like this, but it is clear that employers need to be taking account of the risks to which people are being exposed. And I think there are some better online support materials now being provided by the health and safety executive on things like ergonomics, of the use of display screen equipment and laptops and so on. And also organisations like Mind and various others are producing quite good guidance on how to manage mental health remotely as well. So I think that's a really important area, and I'm sure Abigail will pick up on that a bit later on. One big issue is about how you clarify performance expectations. That's something that obviously managers are concerned about, to make sure that having now a distributed workforce, all of a sudden they don't lose control over both the quantity and quality of work that's being done. I guess there are a number of things there that are quite important. I think, first of all, it's important to have a presumption of goodwill on the part of employees, and that they're going to be honest, and they're going to be performing to the best of their ability at the same time as adjusting to these new circumstances. In some situations, there's nothing worse than feeling that you're not being trusted. And so I think that if you're suspicious that people are trying to game the current system, then you might be getting off on a negative foot. So I think it's really important to try and be positive and appreciative, and assume that people want to do a good job. I think if people seem to be in distress, or not, their performance is not so good as you might expect, then it's probably right not to assume that they're being lazy or trying to manipulate the situation to their own advantage. I think it's important to look out for some underlying factors, what's happening in their domestic circumstances. It's much more difficult remotely to use body language as a way of identifying whether someone's having a mental health problem, for example. And using Zoom and all these other online platforms is no really good substitute. But if you do know that someone has elderly care responsibilities or childcare responsibilities, or maybe struggling for other reasons, managers need to be ultra sensitive to this. We don't expect them to be clinical psychologists, but signposting them to support, such as an employee assistance program or some other online support, is probably a good thing to do. And that could explain why people are struggling in terms of their performance. I think the other thing that you can do is to discuss people's challenges with peers. I think we're seeing team working morphing into a slightly different mode of working at the moment, and using online team chats and so on is one way that you can make sure that everyone is connected with each other, and that people are beginning to share performance objectives more explicitly and so on. And if someone is struggling, then perhaps team members and peers might be able to help managers to identify the problem and perhaps to resolve them. I think we also need to think about changing the way we schedule work. I've seen examples of people saying, look, because myself and my partner have childcare responsibilities, I'm only going to be able to be online between these hours during the week, and the rest of the time I'm having to play tag team with my partner in terms of childcare. That sort of thing has to be respected. I think that people won't cope if they feel they're under the cosh and they're under scrutiny for 8 or 9 hours a day. If people have got those sort of responsibilities, then I think it's really important that organisations help them to schedule things. You should expect them to be clear and to stick to those schedules where possible. But we're all having to learn about boundary setting and how we need to mutually rely on each other to work to those schedules. And I think line managers need to be flexible and compassionate in the way they manage that. I think sometimes we also have to think about whether or not we're really more important in what people produce in their jobs rather than how long or when they produce it. we sometimes have a bit of an obsession about people, working enough hours. If they're competent enough to deliver what you want in 4 hours rather than 8, or they want to get up at 4 in the morning to do something or work late, that's totally down to them. They shouldn't feel pressurized to do that. You need to think as a manager about whether or not inputs are more important than outputs. And in general, outputs tend to trump inputs in this situation. So have those conversations with individuals and teams. As I mentioned, Zoom isn't a substitute for being empathetic or being observant or spotting the weak signals of declining mental health. And that's something that you just need to develop and perhaps get some support for. And also, just please remember as a manager that a random act of kindness doesn't make you weak. There is still this sort of command and control macho approach to management, which I think is just inappropriate at the moment. And people need some sensitivity. And so being kind and compassionate to people usually gives you some payback. So try it if it's not part of your normal repertoire. And then making working from home now might work better now that we've had a sort of natural experiment of how it can work. I think lots of organisations have perhaps had traditional uncertainty or reluctance to adopt flexible working practices. And I think we've now got an opportunity to see that actually many of the things people fear about it, like losing control or people gaming the system, may well not happen. I think that people enjoy being trusted, they enjoy having autonomy, they enjoy having discretion, and I think that can pay dividends. So I think that once the crisis is over, we'll see greater openness towards greater flexibility in working. And the debate that we had about 4-day week working or compressed hours working may well come back as a serious area for discussion and debate after the crisis is over. So overall, I would say that it's important for managers to themselves adjust. We also need to recognise that managers themselves are, if you like, the squeezed middle in all this. So they have pressure from below and pressure from above. And that we need to also watch out for the mental health and well-being of managers in all this. But managers can make a really big difference, as we've seen in our survey, to the way people are experiencing this lockdown. And I think there's pretty strong evidence that the more flexible, compassionate and empathetic managers are, both in terms of the communication, but also the managing of performance, the more they'll get back from their employees and the more sustainable this lockdown will be, because it's obviously set to increase by another at least 3 weeks if the government is true to its word in its announcements today. So IAS is doing quite a lot of work on this. We're doing work on remote coaching. We're doing work on looking at what the wider labour market implications of all this in terms of youth unemployment and what the government can do in terms of improving productivity, how we avoid, big crashes in earnings and so on after the crisis is over. If you want to complete our survey, it's open till the end of April, and the link is there on that last slide. And if you'd like to know any more about the survey itself or the work that we're doing at IAS, please do get in touch or follow me on Twitter. I'm obviously very happy to take any questions you have a bit later on.
Great, that's super. Thank you so much, Stephen. Very interesting points there and some good practical tips for employers. It will, as you say, it will be interesting to see what work looks like post-COVID. I'm delighted to introduce Vince now. Of course, Stephen will be here afterwards for your questions and answers, so do keep those coming in. Vince is an employment lawyer with Lewis Silkin, as you already know, and he will be looking now at an update on the furlough and employment law changes, as well as addressing the questions that you sent in last week. So over to you, Vince. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Well, let's get rid of the first slide. We're now into version 3 of the furlough arrangements, and furloughing reminds me very much of when people watch Winter Olympics, and all of a sudden is on the bobsleigh is everybody becomes an overnight expert, and someone will come and do a run and everybody will go, oh, it was too high on the fourth corner there. That's not going to be a good time. Unfortunately, these furlough arrangements have changed so quickly that even ourselves as lawyers have found difficulty keeping track of it. And therefore, I have some significant sympathy with employers who may already have furloughed employees or may be considering furloughing employees under the government scheme. Just some figures, the government have now estimated that it's going to be approximately 40 billion in costs of the furlough program until the end of May. There are 3 times as many people being furloughed as what the government first anticipated. The Inland Revenue have indicated is that records must be kept for 5 years, which suggests is there will be some significant auditing after the furlough has come to an end, whenever that is. Yesterday late evening, and I'm afraid it's not in my slides, but I have sent a link through for people who are participating in this video conference, that Her Majesty's Revenue and Custom have finally, and the word finally should be underlined, published their guidance as to how they see the furloughing working and what is and is not in. And I would strongly recommend, and I'm not saying this because I'm a lawyer and I may have some vested interest in this, but I am saying is these guidance, which is called a directive, need to be reviewed and need to be reviewed carefully, and you need to take some legal advice, because if you get this wrong, in 5 years' time, you could end up owing the Treasury a considerable sum of money because you haven't complied with the rules in respect of furloughing. That to one side, let me deal now with where I think we're at as of, let me check my watch, 21 minutes past 11 on the 16th of April. The government have updated the furlough guides again. Unfortunately, as I say, there is no further guidance on holiday and how it's going to be viewed, and can we furlough people? Can we put people on holiday while they're on furlough, or that's permissible under the working time regulations? It's unclear whether that is the situation insofar as furlough. What the government has confirmed, which is important, is that sick leave on SSP, people can be put on furlough and vice versa. But what the directions say is that if you are going to go onto sick leave, and whilst on sick leave, the employer starts the furloughing people, and you'd be one of the people who'd be furloughed, your period of furlough is delayed until you finish your sick leave, which is either 7 or 14 days. Thereafter, you then can be furloughed. If you become sick again whilst on furlough, that period of time is discounted. So effectively, once you've been sick, then you're on furlough. If you get sick again, even though you're furloughed, that is discounted as part of the process, and that's within the directions which we've received. Employers who are shielding, there was some previous confusion about whether or not there had to be an alternative redundancy. That's now been removed. They're just treated as being furloughed if that was what would happen. People who are TUPE'd, so if there is some economic activity out there and people are still acquiring businesses, then you will notice that an employer who's TUPE'd to a new employer after the 26th of February can be furloughed. So that's good news there. Employers returning from statutory leave, i.e. maternity, family leave or sick leave, should be furloughed, pay calculated on the basis of their actual salary and not on the pay they were getting whilst they were on their statutory leave. And this was a question we had, I think it's a couple of weeks ago now, and this has now been clarified. Again, confirmation that all categories of visas and granted can be dealt with under the scheme. And of course, it is an offence to have access to public funds for someone dealing with visas, etc. That is now being clarified. National insurance contributions are paid at the subsidised furlough pay rate, and pension contributions are at the minimum level of 3% of qualifying earnings. One of the outstanding questions which we were concerned about was when people have salary sacrifice and effectively are operating on a lower pay because they've salary sacrificed their gym membership, their pension contributions in order to take advantage of of not paying national insurance contributions. Well, what it made absolutely clear is that all grants received are to cover employers' subsidised furlough pay and must be paid to them in the form of money. They cannot top up, the employers cannot top up the salary sacrifice. So that's an important clarification. So no part of the grant should be netted off to pay for those benefits. And of course, the government have indicated to the one above, they've indicated that pension contributions will be paid at the minimum, and therefore employees will no doubt have to pay their contribution to their pension pot if they're on auto enrollment. But of course, some people will give notice that they don't want to do that because simply they're already on 80% of salary. So that's a one to watch. Now, as of 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, right, that should be on the 15th of April, by the way, not the 4th, the 5th of April. There was a change in government policy, and the key payroll eligibility has changed from the 28th of February to the 19th of March. Why this change was brought about, it may have been, is because they've made concession about employers being able to rehire people who left, who were employed at the 28th of February, then left, and effectively following a campaign by Martin Lewis of the BBC Money Programme, the government did some tweets in which they indicated that employers could take people back. So it appears as now that there's a change in the date, and effectively the date now is the 19th of March. You've got to have been on the payroll of the 19th of March. Having read the directive, there's some significant rules about what we would describe as new employers. And this, I think, is an anti-fraud or an anti-corruption element. What they're indicating is that, yes, you can register yourself with the revenue as a new employer, but you have to have a track record that you were an employer prior to that registration. So your new business, simply, you've got to have a track record that you've employed people previously in order to qualify. And this, of course, is to stop the invention of employees who then come onto the payroll in order to receive furlough. And the government and Her Majesty's Revenue and Custom have already picked up on a number of occasions when people have indicated that they've gone outside of the records, which they have. So again, is that there's some anti-avoidance and anti-corruption measurements within it. But the guidance do state is that based on the previous guidance, the employer can calculate basis the employer's salary as of the 20th of February, or they can then now choose the 19th of March, whichever is the most, I suppose, advantageous for the employee. But of course, it's still only 80% of their salary up to a maximum 2,500. Employers who employed as the 20th of February and on payroll, again, and the employer has submitted documentation, of course, were made redundant. Those people can, of course, be brought back into employment now. And that is effectively the whole purpose behind this scheme, is a job retention scheme. And therefore, it's important that, having looked at the way in which the legislation is now framed in the direction, is it important is that, you know, that change was spelled out in the directions, and this is the advice and the guidance to employers as to how this is going to operate. But as I said at the start of this discussion, there is some disparity between the guidings and the directions. So the directions are really what we now need to be focused on, less so the directions which the government have indicated. So that's where we're at as I now 11:30 on the 16th of April. We as a business as a law firm, our support lawyers are busily looking at the legislation, and there will be some guidance on our coronavirus website. That the address is on the last slide, and that should be posted sometime later this morning, or certainly before close of business today. dealing with the questions that rose on last occasion is, what do you do about staff who volunteer for furlough and receive 80% as they are concerned about vulnerable family members, but they are not furloughed and end up working more hours unpaid than normal? Well, the legislation is quite absolutely clear on this. It says that an employer is either furloughed or not. You cannot be in a halfway house. You are either working for your employer or you're not working for your employer. You can work for another employer because it's separate code, tax code, but you cannot work for the employer that furloughed you. And as I say here, most salaried employees, and it was interesting what Stephen was saying about white collar workers, most salaried employees who work at home like myself at the moment, is we work additional hours to our contractual hours without the additional payment of overtime. But of course, the benefit that we have, of course, is that we receive a salary, and the salary it encapsulates, hopefully, that concept that you may have to work more hours than what you're contractually obliged to do. However, on the question, and this is the essence of the question, an employer, irrespective of the terms of their contract, is entitled to the national minimum wage. So you've got to be very careful, is that people who are on low wage do not fall foul of the national minimum wage per hour of work in which they say they're working. So it's very important that employers keep a track of that. And we know that the revenue, and I've been involved in some of these when I work, some of my clients are hotel owners, is come in and do an audit, and they deal with the audit in such a forensic way. So it is important that we keep records, and it's important that our employees keep records of the hours that they're working. So that's to deal with that particular question. The next question, which I thought was a really interesting question, and I've tried to spell this out as much as possible. And now, of course, this is now set out in part in the guidance. Is, are people who are shielding either on high risk or living with a high risk person, and work is available for them, entitled to SSP for 12 weeks? Well, unfortunately, the answer to that is, in relation to SSP, people who are shielding because of high risk or they are living with someone with high risk, we think that they will probably not be entitled to statutory sick pay. They are entitled under the directions to be furloughed, and furlough often will, of course, pay more than the statutory sick pay. So I don't think it's really an issue as far as that's concerned. Now, this may be clarified, and as I say, is that, but having quickly looked at the rules, is I'm not sure that it is at the moment in the directions. But it is important, is that that it appears that that the government guidance is followed. Therefore we need to ensure is the whole basis of the government's policy at the moment. I apologize. The government policy at the moment is that one is for people to self-isolate because of their symptoms for 7 days, or they're in the household with someone else with symptoms, is 14 days. But the directions on the 6th week certainly make it clear is that people can be furloughed even though they're at home, is rather than relying upon SSP for 12 weeks. And I think that's an important element to the change, because the whole purpose about the furloughing is a job protection scheme. And it's important is that we look at each individual case. As I said, the updated guidance states that employers are entitled to furlough employees who have been shielded, and it's up to the employer to decide whether they furlough those employees. And clearly, if someone is at home shielding for 12 weeks and furloughing for a minimum of 3 weeks, and remember, as of Friday, as of tomorrow, it is 45 days to the end of the first round of furloughing in accordance to the legislation. And it's also tomorrow 45 days if some people are considering making people redundant, more than 100 people, to start of the consultation process in respect of those redundancies. So I think this is a one to watch, but it is for employers to make that decision. And finally, this is our website, which contains frequently asked questions, Q&As for employers. There's lots and lots of information up there for you to use. It's free to use to both to clients and to non-clients. So please, if you feel as though you have any issues, then please visit that website. And thank you very much.
That is lovely. Thank you so much, Vince. As ever, a great, reassuring and comprehensive look at some pretty technical and thorny issues there. We do have quite a few questions for you, so if you could stick about, that would be fantastic. And in the meantime, we have a poll for you, the audience, just to make sure everyone is still with us. There it should be on your screen now for you to answer. Does that come up? Is that polling? And there's another one coming up too. Okay, we have Abigail Hirshman up next from ACAS. Abigail, are you with us? Have we managed to get your sound working? If not, we have pre-recorded Abigail's session, so we will be able to play that for you now through the magic that is my assistant Katie. So thank you very much indeed, and I'm going to play this video for you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Abigail Hirshman. I'm Head of Mental Health and Wellbeing for ACAS. So what I'm going to do today is just run through some points and some guidance on managing mental health in the current climate. I've put some links on the slide, so please reference them afterwards. There is quite a lot of content, so I'll be touching on it rather than going through everything in detail. But there's lots of information for you to look at, and you're welcome to contact me afterwards. My details are on this slide, so please get in touch if you'd like to have any more information or discuss anything in more detail. So just to start off, this is ACAS's position in terms of mental health at work prior to the pandemic and absolutely during the pandemic. What we recognise is that in order to really manage mental health at work from an individual and organisational perspective, we need to have three key players. So the employers need to be responsible, the managers need to have responsibility, and individuals need responsibility. Again, there's a link on this if you want to find out more information, but it really is important that everybody works together, because that is going to have the greatest impact on how we get through this time and how we continue to run a functional, sustainable workforce. So what I just want to touch on is what we know already. This was the latest guidance that came out just before we went into the lockdown situation by the What Works Wellbeing Centre, and it focuses on 5 key factors that impact on both wellbeing and productivity. The ones in purple are the preventative mechanisms, and the ones in grey are the responsive, reactive measures. And I think if we look at this now through the current lens, we can see that maybe our help for struggling workers and our health and wellbeing programmes need to be brought front and centre, because it's so important to recognise the issues that our staff face so that we can keep them working well, so that when we are back up to speed or trying to get back up to speed, we have a workforce that can function. The other things that I think have changed during this pandemic, so where the lens has shifted, is the impact on social relationships. So the fact that we are self-isolating or that we are separate from our normal family and social groups means that the work connections that we can establish are absolutely vital in helping people to feel connected. Connectivity, from a technical perspective and from a personal perspective, is a key determinant for how well we feel. So anything that organisations can do in terms of maintaining connection between staff, encouraging it, taking away those normal social constraints is absolutely essential. So these are some of the issues that have come up that I've recognised in discussions with employers and seen amongst my own staff. So I'm just going to quickly touch on some of these. So if you look at the bottom of the curve, I think what started with what's going on, everything's changed. all of a sudden we were asked to totally change and adapt the way we lived, the way we worked, without any choice. This was taken out of our control, and everyone has stepped up and adapted, and it's quite phenomenal seeing how businesses have responded to this. But we can't forget that was a shock for people, and people will be carrying that shock through for a period to come. But maybe we think about this as a positive as well. We can see, that people who maybe wanted to work from home previously, where organisations said this wasn't feasible or functional with the type of work we do, actually now they can, and they can see how they can adapt their working practices. But then we mustn't forget that for lots of people, they are now working alongside their small children who are being schooled. They're working alongside family members. So how does the outputs get done when we have these other responsibilities? So I think workplaces need to recalibrate thinking about things from a time perspective, i.e. you sign on from 9 to 5, and thinking more from a what do you need to achieve today? What do we need you to help us with to keep our business running? Then, as I said down below, maybe people are going through loneliness. We have a loneliness epidemic before this even started. So how are we maintaining social connections? How are we helping people to feel integrated and connected? And then we mustn't forget at the bottom that we will be experiencing loss during this period. Whatever that loss may be, it may be tangible loss of family, friends, colleagues. So it's also thinking about how we respond to that. But then as we go up through the curve, people may be scared about losing their jobs. So how are you communicating what your plans are? There's lots of organisations who are really focusing on the mental health and wellbeing aspect, which is really, really essential. But they're sort of forgetting to communicate what we are doing as a business and the business wellbeing aspects. And then as we move along the curve, maybe we can think about some of the benefits that we've had, as I said, enjoying those team contacts. The social hierarchies or business hierarchies are really flattened in this climate. And that's a really good thing. That's a really positive thing, especially when we think about employee voice. And then we move forward to then thinking about when we go back to work and how you then readjust those relationships, given the fact that we started to see maybe our bosses, the background, how our boss lives, the fact that they maybe have children, dogs, whatever it is we didn't know about them before, we've suddenly opened up those barriers. So what's really important, though, is who we have in our workplace and how we can spot the signs that that person may be struggling. And what I've done here is just given you some information in terms of the mental health continuum. So we have James over in the left. James has a mental health condition. James has PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. So a traumatic incident happened to James, which gave him a period of anxiety. But James has good mental well-being. On the right of James, we have Jane. Jane is one of those people. She's always ready to help. She's always active and engaged in the workplace. Maybe she signs up as an NHS volunteer. She's helping her elderly relatives. She's helping her neighbours. But what happens to Jane in this time? Does Jane actually start to overextend herself? Does she start to take on more? How can you spot the signs that maybe Jane, who's normally a pretty resilient worker, is starting to struggle? And then if we move around the curve and we look at Lisa, Lisa sometimes, finds it too much pressure can affect Lisa. So how is Lisa coping? What would we know? Would we see that Lisa would be maybe a bit grumpy when you have your team meetings? Maybe she withdraws. Maybe she doesn't attend them. Maybe she's quite challenging to management. What are the signs that maybe Lisa is struggling? And then we move round to Declan. Maybe Declan has depression. He has a diagnosis. He's not well. He's been off sick in the past. Is there a reasonable adjustment that was put in place for Declan that may not be relevant now? Have you had discussions with Declan on how he's keeping himself well? And again, in terms of the signs and symptoms of some of these conditions, anxiety, depression, and more complex conditions, I put some links here for you to find some information on these. But what we really need to think about is how are we engaging with our workers? Who is in our workplace? What are the signs and symptoms they had before? And how can we recognise when they may be moving along this continuum, either down to more poorer mental well-being or where their mental health condition is becoming more significant? So how do we do that? And there's been lots and lots of guidance and advice out there about staying in touch. And these are just some pointers for you to think about in addition to ones you may know already. So it's about that blend of one-to-one, team and social meetings, how you actually adjust all of those, using video calls wherever possible, seeing people's faces, seeing the whites of their eyes has such a positive impact on our well-being. It really can't be undermined. And although some people may be uncomfortable with video calling, I'd really encourage that to be considered as far as possible. Ask your staff, what are they doing to keep themselves well? As we said, this is a collective responsibility. And don't be afraid to express your concern. Stick to what you've noticed, that you've observed, you've seen. What are the patterns? Not as in just a speculation. And then think about the questions, think about confidentiality, what those boundaries are, and then about your reasonable adjustments if somebody has a diagnosis, and then think about resources like your wellness action plans. And then drawing upon your range of resources. So some of these you may have in place already, some of these may be new, some of these you may want to consider. I was working with an employer who had a whole strategy ready to go, they just hadn't signed it off, and now they're working at pace to think about which parts do they really want to address, what are the priority areas to really push forward now, and then what are the things that can wait to when businesses start to come back to normal. And then finally, some more delicate issues, some things that maybe hadn't been on your radar before, but maybe now need to be on your radar as HR professionals and as leaders. So thinking about domestic abuse, there has been lots of publicity about the increase in this, the calls, but actually what we notice that only 5% of employers currently have a specific policy or guideline. So think about your policy, and this may increase disclosure if you do introduce guidance around this. Raise awareness of what to look out for, and make sure you have some key staff who are trained in providing signposting. So somewhere that people can go. Don't leave everything up to the line manager. The line manager is going to have a lot on their plate. So think about other resources in your organisation. And again, I put down some links and resources. The Home Office guidance has got such a fantastic range of links for you to consolidate in terms of your organisational needs. Secondly, another issue is about financial well-being. This is a massive, massive issue that's going to have short and long-term impacts for people. So be transparent about the financial changes to your business. Think about your EAP. Does that have any financial advice? And again, communicate external links and resources. There's often a lot of shame around having financial difficulties. So accept that people may not come to you as an employer, as a manager, but they may want to find other resources that they can access. And some organisations are thinking about ways of doing short-term loans to people to help tide them over this process. And then finally, illness and bereavement. As I mentioned before, it is possible this is something that we will have to face, all of us in the organisation, regardless of our role or function. So think about your policies, your special leave policies, your attendance policies, are they clear and up to date? Make sure when you talk to staff about this that you'll stick to just very basic information with them. People will be in shock. So think about how you repeat that information to them, because they may not take it all in on the first time. And again, I put some links there for you. And then very finally, just thinking about those self-care, about how we manage our mental health and how we look after our social health and how we look after our physical health, all are absolutely key to getting us through this and to keeping ourselves well, to work well and to feel well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Abigail. That was very, very useful. And I know a lot of those concerns are very close to the heart of people who are watching today. So thank you for that. We have a lot of questions to get through. So I'm just going to check that Vince and Stephen and Abigail are all able to hear the questions and respond. Vince, I'm glad you're here, because I think, as usual, the lion's share are for you. So I'm just going to start now. We have no layoff clause in our contracts, so we have to get written acceptance from our employees to furlough status. What can we do if someone refuses to furlough?
Now that it's clear you do need to have there's three stages. One is that you tell the employee that they're going to be furloughed. Two, that the employee accepts that they're going to be furloughed. And three, the employer writes to the employee telling them that they've been furloughed. That's clear and precise. That's what the directions say. It's been mooted that one can fire and rehire. This is the idea that you can require people to be furloughed. It just doesn't work. The whole purpose about this scheme is a job retention scheme. So firing and rehiring is not an option. Fire and rehiring is only an option if you want to reduce someone's salary. If someone does not wish to be furloughed and you have no work for that person, then the alternative to furlough is what furlough is the alternative to, is redundancy. And that's the bottom line, really. Very few people have layoff clauses. Most layoff clauses that I've come across, I do a lot of work in the motor industry. The motor industry has lots of layoff clauses within their contractual terms and conditions. But you're absolutely right, it's very, very unusual. But I just think is that if someone does not wish to be furloughed and we have no work for that person to do, then they come clearly within the definition, and that's the alternative to furloughing is redundancy.
Okay, and a question that touched on a couple of the things that you've just mentioned. An ex-employee left for another job in March, which has subsequently fallen through. They're now asking to be re-employed and furloughed by us. If we did this, would we have to hand back full employment rights? E.g., will we have to pay his full notice period again when we end his contract at the end of furlough? And would he have to be paid 100% salary, the same as our other furloughed employees, to avoid discrimination claims? What a thorny one.
This is the master, if I can put it that way. Martin Lewis, he obviously had a friend who had applied for a job and hadn't got, and it had all fallen through, and therefore had a campaign to Martin Lewis. Neither. I may be decrying the man, but I think this is madness. Personally, I mean, I'm an ex-shop steward. I used to work for the trade union movement. I really think this is madness for anybody to be considering someone who's left the business to be taken back on. And the person who asked the question is absolutely right. Is if you take someone back on, you can take them back on a fixed-term contract for a short period of time, so long as they haven't got the continuity period in respect of previous employment, not being rehired within 7 days of them leaving or the working off somewhere else. But if it all falls through, give us a call, please come back. That kind of platitude that often goes about. But my view is, and this may sound harsh and it may sound my view is, I think that you are storing up a whole series of problems for yourself if you rehire people who have left and they brought them back for the pure purposes of furlough. Because if they left by reason of a redundancy or left by some selection process, then effectively that selection process would have to go through again. And the first selection process could be questioned as to whether it was fair because you're taking them back on. And it might sound terrible, what I'm saying to people is, and some of my colleagues disagree with my approach on this, but my view is don't go there. Absolutely don't go there, because you then get tied into a whole series of arguments. And the person's right, you've got to treat people the same. Of course, if you bring them back on a fixed term contract with a different types of terms and conditions, well, that's different. But no.
Okay. I've got one more question for you, and then I'm going over to Abigail next. But Vince, a question. I was under the impression that the national minimum wage only related to working time and not furlough time. Is this incorrect?
No, that's true. It is the furlough wage is 80% of what your wage would have been. The question, that's true. But what the question that was being addressed is that people are working additional hours. Well, you can't work additional hours if you're furloughed because you can't work. It's as simple as that. So it cannot be paid work that people are doing. The legislation says if people are doing training in respect of the period of time in which they are training, then they're entitled to at least the national minimum wage for that period of time, even though they are furloughed. So there is a grey area here, but that's what the legislation says. So no, you're absolutely right. Is that whatever your 80% is, your 80%. If you're asked to do training by your employer and that takes time, then you can claim the national minimum wage in respect to that, or it's got to be paid at least at the national minimum wage in respect to that training time. But training is permissible because people obviously see is upskilling themselves whilst they're at home.
Great. Okay, stay there because there's a lot more for you. Abigail, are you able to hear me okay? Do we have Abigail? Yes, you might need to speak up a wee bit. It sounds like you've fallen down a very, very, very long well. Hopefully you haven't. Okay, not to worry. Vince, I'm afraid I'm going to come back with... okay, for those employees who received a pay increase on the 1st of March, but we have calculated furlough pay based on the 28th of February salary, which was based on the old guidance. New guidance states that we can continue with the 28th of February calculations for our first claim. Are we then required to recalculate for May payroll based on new salaries from the 1st of March, or continue using the 28th of February calculations?
My view would be you've got to recalculate, because your second period of furlough is a new period of furlough. Your first period of furlough comes to an end. You then have to re-furlough someone again, which may sound strange, but that's what the legislation says. So irrespective of what your first period of furlough is, so if your first period of furlough is from you're saying, I'm going to furlough people from the 1st of March, and I'm going to take them all the way through to the 31st of May, which is the end of this scheme. And my view would be is this scheme will not be repeated after the 31st of May. There will be a scheme, but it'd be a less generous scheme after the 31st. I mean, that's my personal view. I just think the government figures don't stack up. 40 billion in the first period it's unsustainable, really.
Sure.
It's very generous. So my view would be is when you come to do your second period of furloughing, which is a new period of furloughing, is then you need to recalculate. And the legislation says is that you can choose on the 19th of March, but of course this is going to happen after the 19th of March by its very nature, because that's 21 days. And it's not 3 weeks anymore. It says in the legislation now 21 days, a minimum of 21 days is a new period of furloughing. And that would then be the furloughing pay based upon the pay increase. Of course, going back to the earlier point that was raised is, of course, you could say to people, and I've got a lot of clients have done this, I've written to people who have got pay rises and basically said, we would like you to forego the pay rise until September because of the issues that we have in respect of cash flow, etc. So that's a potential solution to your problem. But I do think if it's a new period of furlough, then yes, you've got to pay the new level. Okay,
great. That was a bit sort of take away the number you first thought of, wasn't it? Stephen, can you hear us if I ask you a question? I have yes? Okay, I'm going to give you and Abigail a question that's come in, and then I'll go back to Vince. Perhaps you could reply on the chat so that we're actually addressing the things that people are asking us now. A mental health issue. Two, actually. Firstly, are there any pieces of practical advice you give for an employer who has an employee who's struggling with isolation and remote working and clearly isn't coping? What are a couple of things that employer could do this week? And secondly, should employers rewrite or adjust their mental health policies to include the significant issues that the coronavirus lockdown is having on both employees and employers alike? So that's homework for you two. And I've got a question for Vince. What if shielding employees started after the 19th of March and cannot be furloughed? What are their options if they're high risk?
Why can't they be furloughed?
Magda, I think because they started after the 19th of March. Magda, would you like to elucidate if that's not right?
They started employment with the employer after the 19th of March.
Yes, started after the 19th.
Well, then, according to the scheme, you've got to be on payroll as of the 19th of March to be subject to furlough. Mm-hmm. Therefore, if they're shielding, etc., then effectively SSP is your potential for the periods of time, which is 14 or 7 days. And this was this was the point I was making in the slide, is that there's an inconsistency here, which needs to be addressed, because clearly is that, you know, some people who have started, and I've got clients who were saying to me, well, these people have started, they're not covered by furlough, they started after the 28th of February, what should we do? You know, they have now agreed that they're going to be furloughed because everybody else has been furloughed. But I do think is that shielding is if you can't get the money through SSP, then effectively you're looking at universal credit, because you're not going to have any money if the company's not going to pay you. So I do think that's a potential problem. But I do think SSP is potentially the solution to that problem. But if you're after the 19th of March, it doesn't extend, or at the moment it doesn't extend. But of course, there will be a new furloughing program which will come in on the 1st of June, and we'll see what that has to say.
Great. Well, I think we can stand you down there. Vince, thank you so much for your contribution, and obviously to Abigail and Stephen as well. Much appreciated. Any outstanding questions, we will attempt to have those addressed and sent out to you when we send the recordings to you after today's webinar finishes. Next week, we'll try and raise the tone a little bit and not be quite so gloomy. We'll look at the medium term and how organisations can start getting ready for recovery. So we'll concentrate on workforce planning, issues around restructuring, maintaining positive relationships with your unions during and after the crisis. And we will hear an interesting case study from a global company on how they are coping through the lockdown and coronavirus. Just to let you know, for those of you who've answered that yes, you're almost back to business as normal, or whatever normal is these days, first, congratulations. And secondly, to let you know that we are currently adapting majority of our training courses, which I know some of you here today had already registered for before I think we can say all hell broke loose, can't we? Before that, in the olden days. So those are being adapted for online and social distancing. So please have a look at our website, and then hopefully you can continue with your professional learning there. Thank you, as always, for bearing with us today. Thank you for your feedback, and we look forward to seeing you again next Thursday. I wish you all a very peaceful week. Thank you.